This is the second part of Unit 5 of AP US History, which describes the during of the Civil War. So we have the Secession Crisis. In December of 1860, South Carolina met and voted to secede from the Union. 6 other states followed by March of 1861. This area that seceded would be known as the Deep South. The Crittenden Compromise was proposed as a constitutional amendment that would guarantee slavery where it was and reestablish the Missouri Compromise line in all of the U.S. territory. Republicans such as Lincoln did not support this plan. Next, we have Fort Sumner, which was a Union fort in South Carolina. Confederate leaders ordered the capture of the fort, and on April 12th, firing began, and it ended on April 14th. It ended with the fort being captured. After this, Lincoln mobilized for war, and 4 more southern states withdrew from the Union. After this, only 4 more slave states remained in the Union, and these were called the border states. At the beginning of the war, Lincoln's main purpose was to preserve the Union and not to get rid of slavery, but that would change with the Emancipation Proclamation. The North had certain advantages in the Civil War. They had a higher population, more industries, which would help with war production. They had an advanced transportation system, and they had a lot of farmland. The Southerners also had an advantage. This includes fighting a defensive war because they knew the land better. They also had a very united white population, and they also had better military leadership from previous wars, as that was part of the Southern culture. Moving on, we have the mobilization of the North. So the economics during the war in the North include the population of the West. So we have the Homestead Act in 1862, which provided 160 acres of land for people to move to in the West. And in return for this, after 5 years of living there, they would have to improve that land. We also have the Pacific Railroad Act, which was created in 1862, and this created railroad subsidies for the Transcontinental Railroad. We also have the Morrill Land Grant, which was created in 1862. This was federal land that was given to states to use for education. Tariffs during this time were also raised to the highest level in history that they had at that point. We also have National Bank Acts of 1863 and 1864, which said that the banks could join together and issue treasury notes. This stabilized the North's monetary system and also made sure that greenbacks were more regulated than graybacks. Along with these, the way that the North financed its war was the taxes, the greenbacks, and bonds. We also have the Conscription Act / the Enrollment Act of 1863. This was where Congress instituted a draft. However, the wealthy could hire a substitute for $300. Because of this, the Civil War became known as the rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. The drafts led to draft riots, such as the NYC draft riot of July in 1863. This was where 100 plus deaths occurred over a span of 4 days. Along with the Union, some people argued that Lincoln had more executive power than was given to him. He sent troops and increased the size of the military without congressional approval, and he also suspended habeas corpus, which is something that only Congress can do. He also shut down some newspapers in Maryland. Next, we have the election of 1864, which was Lincoln versus George McClellan, who was a former Union general. Lincoln won the Electoral College vote with a landslide, but the popular vote was close. Now we have early emancipation, which started with the Confiscation Act of 1861, which said that slaves that were used in Southern military efforts could be considered free. We also have another Confiscation Act, which occurred in 1862, which said that the president could use freed slaves as soldiers. Next, we have the Emancipation Proclamation, which was an executive order to free all slaves that were in the areas of the Confederacy that were in rebellion. This took effect in January of 1863, but it did not affect the border states. The Emancipation Proclamation changed the Civil War effort from being not about slaves to now it's about slaves. This was really helpful for the Union because Europe was thinking about getting involved in the war but helping the Confederacy, and now that slavery was involved in the war, they could not get involved. Moving on, we have African Americans in war. Escaped slaves from the Confederacy were considered contraband and would not be returned. We also have Black soldiers, such as the 54th Infantry, Black enlistment really increased after the Emancipation Proclamation. However, Black soldiers were paid less and were often used for manual labor rather than actually fighting. We also have women in the war, which can be seen in the North as a lot of women joined the war effort as nurses. Next, we move on to mobilization of the South. So the government of the Confederacy had most power residing in the states. The president of the Confederacy was Jefferson Davis, and his vice president was Alexander Stephens. The economy of the Confederacy had no uniform currency system, which increased inflation. Women involvement in the South included wives who were put in charge of farming as their husbands fought. And for widowed women, they had to find jobs to support themselves and their families. Moving on, we have the diplomacy and strategies of the North and the South. The South had better military leadership than the North. The South decided to fight a defensive war because they had better morale at the beginning. They also had the idea of King Cotton diplomacy, which made them think that because Europe really relied on the Southern cotton, that they would join the war effort. However, this did not actually happen because Europe had a large stock of cotton that had piled up from years of trading before. And by the time they would have needed to help the South, the Emancipation Proclamation had happened, which made it so that the Europeans could not help the South because they were in support of slavery and the Europeans were not okay with slavery. Next, we have the Northern strategy. They used the Anaconda Plan. This Anaconda Plan was where the Northerners blockaded the South. This was able to happen because the Northerners had a superior navy to the Southern Navy. Next, we have some key people of the Civil War. Obviously, we have President Lincoln, who was the president of the North. We also have the president of the South, who was Jefferson Davis. Henry Rager Halleck and Ulysses S. Grant were both generals in the United States, and Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson were both leaders of the military in the South. Next, we move on to some important battles during the Civil War. First, we have the Bull Run Massacre, which occurred in July of 1861. This began as a Union winning early on, but Stonewall Jackson managed to hold his ground, and eventually reinforcements for the Confederates came and the Union ended up retreating. This made the North realize that this would be a hard-fought war, and this gave the South a lot of confidence. Next, we have the Battle of Antietam, which occurred in September of 1862. This was Lee's first attempt to take the fight directly to the Union. This battle ended up in pretty much a draw, but the North viewed it as a victory because Maryland did not secede and they were forced to return to Virginia. This battle was used by Lincoln to create the Emancipation Proclamation. We also have Gettysburg, which occurred in July of 1863. This was the first Confederate invasion into the North. The battle at Gettysburg led to the Gettysburg Address, which occurred in November of 1863, which was when the battlefield was created into a cemetery. This speech was used to increase the morale of the North. We also have Sherman's March to the Sea, which took place from November to December in 1864. After Sherman took his military group into Atlanta and burned the place down, he divided his forces in half and took them to march to Savannah. On his way to Savannah, he destroyed everything in his path. In April of 1865, we have Lee surrender at the Appomattox Courthouse. Once the Civil War was over, Lincoln did not really get to appreciate that time of peace because he was killed on April 14th of 1865.